So hello, everyone. Again, I would like to welcome you to the Rocks lecture series and a very warm welcome to our speaker today, Dr. Dr Sandberg. Ole is an environmental philosopher at the University of Iceland, working on climate change and biodiversity in partnership with biologists at the Icelandic Museum of Natural History. And today we have the pleasure of listening to him talk about nature philosophy in the land of ice and fire, process thinking in an Icelandic context. I'm also very happy to see a large part of the Rocks research team here today in the audience as well. Before we start, there are a few housekeeping words. After Ole's talk, there will be time for discussions, which I would like all of you to participate in, if you like. You are welcome to either speak up or post your questions in the chat. I would also like to remind you that the lecture is recorded, but not the discussions. And the lecture will be available at the Rocks website and on the lecture's Facebook page. So please feel free to keep your cameras off during Ole's talk, but in the discussions, it would be great if we turn them on again so we can feel each other's presence. So now, Ole, I am delighted to have you with us today, and without further ado, I now hand the virtual microphone over to you.
Thank you. Yes, so the talk is called something like Nature Philosophy in the Land of Ice and Fire, as you already mentioned. And yeah, it's about process philosophy. So here I just put in some of the words that are relevant for process philosophy and for Iceland, and which explains why process philosophy is relevant for Iceland. We have contrast, differences, interstices, and process thinking in general. And this is what this talk is about. So Iceland is a land of contrasts and a land of constant change. We have two continental plates that are meeting each other, and that really defines life on this whole island, defines the island itself. It's what created the island. Two different things, colossal things coming together and creating something new. So we have a lot of contrasts, as the tourist slogan says, the land of ice and fire. We have super hot things and super cold things right next to each other meeting. We have boiling lava and ice right next to each other. And we have a whole lot of other types of contrasts, like deserts and really lush areas really close to each other. So a lot of contrasts and also a lot of change. On the top here, you can see the recent eruption in Fagradalsfjall. I hope my pronunciation is okay. Where to the left, you have the area, the valley before the eruption. And on the right, you have it after the eruption or at some point during the eruption. So you can see the land is constantly changing. On the bottom, we have some relatively newly formed lava fields. And on the right, you have several hundred years later where they're covered in moss and other grounds for new life. So life is destroyed, life is reborn, things are happening in constant cycles. Nothing is permanent here. Which brings me to my claim that Iceland is not an island, which is of course a bit silly, but what I mean is that Iceland is not a thing. It's not a static thing. It's a process, a constantly becoming entanglement of interacting difference. I know that's a lot of words, but I'll get to them. But nothing is static here. Everything changes. And that is the perfect conditions for process thinking. But first, a bit about how I came to this. My background is not so much in a process philosophy, but it's in political philosophy. My doctoral research was called Life in Solitary Anthropological Assumptions as Self-Fulfilling Prophecies. And it examines the role theories of human nature has in political, economic theory and policy and on human behavior. So a typical model in political theory could look like this. Human nature is exogenous, it's fixed, it's natural. And then the rest simply follows from that. We get social relations, political philosophies, and institutions, etc. Now, a typical critique would be to say that the premise is wrong. Human nature is not like that. And then the whole system collapses. Both the model itself and that critique would be mechanistic approaches, assuming that human nature is fixed. But what if human nature is not fixed? What if it's affected by the social models and structures and theories? So I proposed a different model where human behavior is part of and shaped by the rest of the model. We can again start with an assumption about human nature, which leads to social models and policies and institutions, which affect actual human behavior, which we can then look at to get our assumptions about human nature. And in this way, it's impossible to know which is the right starting point because it's all one interconnected circle. And that means that we cannot appeal to human nature to build or to critique the political theory. In this model, humans are interactive kinds, as the sociologist Ian Hacking says, not natural kinds. Humans adapt to and react to the social structures and theories, including the stories they tell about themselves, which creates a looping effect that means that the human is never a static thing. Looping effect also comes from Hacking. Now, after my PhD, I then did a brief research project on the concept and value of biodiversity, working with the biologist Skúli Skúlason, who will give a lecture in next month for ROCS. I've previously done I had previously done philosophical work on evolution theory, and I've been a teacher of ethics of nature, so I have some background for doing this project. Ethics of nature, by the way, is founded by Skúli's brother, the philosopher Páll Skúlason, so Skúli also has some philosophical connection. And this is where I was introduced to process philosophy and process biology. And I saw the similarities between the biologist's critique of mechanistic thinking in biology and my critique of it in political theory. So this is the model that the non-mechanistic biologists use, eco, evo, devo. What's interesting, so where the theory is that evolution, development, and ecological surroundings are not like things that can be separated from each other and you can put one first as an ontological primary. The interesting thing is that during this project, I discovered that many animals are also what Ian Hacking would call interactive kinds. That nature changes with their environment and they change their own environment, which creates a looping effect. Because what is it that is the original cause of the change? Is it the environment? Is it the animal? No, it's both. They're all interacting. And this is the idea behind eco, evo, devo, that the three elements cannot be separated. They are an interactive process. And I was just struck by how the similarities between that and my own thinking in political theory and social theory, that we don't have a fixed starting place where we can build the rest of the theory from, because all of the elements are interconnected. Now here with the eco, evo, devo, I think we are on a step towards process philosophy or process biology, but we might not be there completely yet, but this is like the more mainstream of it, I think we could say. But before I get to philosophy, process philosophy proper, let me say what is not process thinking, because I think that makes it easier. The opposite of process thinking is substance thinking. Substance thinking starts with things, natural kinds that have fixed essences, something inside them that make them them. They interact by bouncing into each other, limiting each other's movements, but do not change each other's essential substance. For example, a claim about a fixed human nature that exists outside of and is independent of human social relations. Political institutions then regulate our behavior, but they do not affect our core nature, only what part of it we act on. So the idea here is that economics or politics, etc., can stop us from acting on certain desires, but they do not stop us from having those desires. They're not part of shaping our desires. Which is the same in economic systems, where you have the idea that you can tax things or regulate things with prices that will make it more or less likely that you will buy a certain product, but the market itself does not shape your desires. And we have the same thing in gene-centric biology, where we start with the genes that make the species, make the individual's item of the species, which are what Richard Dawkins calls immortal coils, the units that stay the same and determine animal behavior and development, but they are not themselves changed. Now, this is just as untrue as in all of the social theories. We also have fantasies about island nations with special unchanging characters and which are independent of and unaffected by events in the world outside. And that is part of my point in Iceland is not an island, not in that sense. Okay, on to process philosophy proper. I'm going to be dropping a lot of names and quotes here. Some of the quotes are quite complicated. I'll leave them on the screen, but not attempt to read them out loud. Instead, I'll give a summary of what the message I take from them. Process philosophy really starts with Heraclitus some 2,500 years ago. He was arguing against the Greek philosophers who tried to find the basic components of everything, the atoms which everything is made of and are constant and never changing. That would give order to the universe. Heraclitus rejected this search. He thought everything is constantly changing and that there are no static atoms, just a process of interaction, contrasts and oppositions which together create the universe and all the things in it. Nietzsche agreed with this. He saw the same concept in Darwin's theory of evolution and thought it would overturn substance thinking, the theory of evolution, that is. Evolution means there are no static or fixed units, no clear boundaries between species or concepts, no clear distinctions, and that everything is a constantly evolving process. So he saw similarities between Darwin's main points, or what he took as the main points in Darwin, and thought this really aligns with what Heraclitus was saying. And Nietzsche thought this should overturn philosophy and the way we think. Another thinker who was deeply inspired by Darwin was Peter Kropotkin. He made his own contributions to evolution theory, and he also made the discoveries that confirmed non-anthropogenic climate change. So the fact that the climate is always fluctuating. He also, both of these and other scientific discoveries led him to the belief that all of science must undergo a change, to the recognition that everything in nature, from the universe itself to the human psyche, is constantly changing, that there are no central parts in control or static, no permanence, but rather that everything is made of federations of other things working together or against each other in dynamic processes. I think, to my knowledge, the first official process philosopher is Alfred North Whitehead. His 1929 book, Process and Reality, is an attempt to create a whole philosophy based on these ideas, where substance is replaced with process. His book is, in my opinion, very hard to read, but what I take from it here is the quote about life existing in the interstices. So not in the things themselves, but in the relations between them, in the spaces between the things. Those are the interesting parts. A modern process thinker is the philosopher and physicist, Karen Barat. She is usually associated with the school of thought called New Materialism, which in my view is an updated version of process philosophy. She has a lot of insights combining theoretical physics and philosophy, but I think this quote is particularly good at summarizing a key concept, that processes, or as she calls it, entanglements, are not the results of different entities meeting, but rather that the entities themselves are the results of their meetings and relations. that process comes first and things come out of that process. And this is the same point made by the psychiatrist and philosopher Eugene Gendlin, who says that things and minds emerge in their interactions. Interactions are not things meeting and relating, but things are the results of interactions. Interaction comes first. So things are not ontologically prior to the interactions. They have already been affected by each other, and they are that mutual affecting. When they become what so here we also see the importance of the concept difference. Difference is needed for a thing to be what it is. You need more than one thing to have any one thing, because a thing emerges from its relations with other things. This is also a central point in the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze, that difference is prior to sameness or identity. This is turning the usual way of thinking upside down, which is what Nietzsche thought we should do. Deleuze wrote his thesis on difference and repetition, saying that we should take difference first and see what kind of thinking, what kind of philosophy, what kind of metaphysics and science comes out of starting with difference, and then see what comes out of it, rather than starting with things and identities. Now, Deleuze wrote a lot with Félix Guattari and developed these thoughts further. One of the concepts is that of assemblage. It's an English word, not a French word. That everything is a collection of interacting processes, which was already noted by Kropotkin. We can understand these assemblages as if they are a specific thing. We can, talk about them like that in our daily language, like they are a defined territory. This is what Deleuze and Guattari means by the territory, that we call a certain part of a process a thing, a territory. But once we have done that, then we can also think further and move on to see how one territory is actually a part of other processes and assemblages, which makes the territory blend into other territories and impossible to actually scientifically demark as one separate unit. So in summary, process thinkers de-emphasize units, things and substances as the primary elements. Things are the results of relational processes, not the causes of them. And they keep being entangled in dynamic processes with other things, so they're constantly affected and changing. Conceptually, of course, we can call a thing like a person a unit, and we can talk about ourselves as distinct from other beings. That's fine, pragmatically speaking. It's how language works. We make categories. But if we zoom in, then it's clear that a human being also consists of the millions of microscopic non-human beings that live in us, and they're not separate from us. They're not just living in us. They are us. They perform many of our vital functions and even affect the way we think and feel. And if we zoom out, it's clear that we're also constantly shaped by our interactions in our environment, the social relations, the air, the climate, etc. So we are processes within processes within processes, assemblages connected to other assemblages, territories bleeding into other territories. Now, a living process is defined by change. That is what being alive is. And change requires difference and diversity. A solitary unit does not change. If there's only one thing in the universe, then it wouldn't be changing. And it wouldn't be alive. Change comes when differences meet. Processes and change requires diversity. Change only happens when different entities interact. So difference and diversity is needed for anything to happen. Diversity is a condition for life in human societies and in nature. And this is a reason why Iceland is interesting from a process perspective. Let's take a look at the website called biodice.is, which is the network of people in Iceland interested in biodiversity, scientists and the public. And they have I think there's 10 points all in all, but I just took the first 3 here, just to emphasize, to show how process thinking is in here. in a document made by biologists. Iceland is at the boundaries, the interstices of large oceanic systems where cold and warm currents meet. So we have contrast, we have difference, and this creates the conditions. This creates the conditions for particular forms of life. It's we have this unstable, which are part of the conditions here. So we have so many different. We don't have a lot of. We don't have like a large number of animals in Iceland. We don't have a large collection of different species, but we do have something unique. We have a whole lot of different ecosystems, hot and cold, dry and wet, etc. Right next to each other very often, not far from each other, right smack down touching each other, which means that there's the conditions for constant creation of new habitats. There is a strategic rhetorical problem here. When I say that everything changes in nature, species evolve, humans grow, societies change, languages evolve, continents move, glaciers grow and retreat, even the Earth's climate naturally changes. And anything that's static is already dead, or at least rotting. So change is good. Does that mean all biological change is good, that all changes in ecosystems are good, or that climate change is good? Of course not. But I do see how this could be a rhetorically dangerous position to when you put it into the public or to politicians, etc. But of course, not all change is good. Changes that destroy the diversity and difference that are required for the natural processes to occur are not conducive to life. They stop the living processes. So changes can be rapid and suddenly destroy whole species. So like the conditions for life, if they happen too fast, for example, so species or societies cannot adapt to them, that would be a bad kind of change because it would decrease the diversity that's necessary for things to meet in a harmonious way and create new things. So we need to think of ways to speak about this in terms that doesn't have a counterproductive effect. What I would like to do is ask you to think rather than conserving substances like species, ecosystems, a particular climate, things like that. Let's think of a process. That the climate that creates the conditions, that the optimal conditions for human life is a process. It's connected with so many other things, and so is a species or anything, an organism. So think of an organism or a species or an ecosystem or nature, life itself, as not a series of discrete fixed entities, but as a continuously ongoing dynamic process, like a hurricane. Now, what would we need to do to preserve a hurricane or a storm? We certainly would not want to keep all its individual pieces fixed. The storm is defined by the motions and energies, the movements and relations. You want to keep the conditions in place that make the storm happen. High pressures meeting cold pressures, cold meeting warm, etc. The storm is created by difference and contrast. So that means that if you want to keep those conditions alive, to have the process of the storm, then the storm would also be out of your control and you'd just be like, you can support it, but you cannot preserve it. Now onwards to Iceland. I'll start with a kind of philosophical critique. Here I have what I call maps of dead things. Clearly delineated. A coastline is clearly delineated things cannot move or interact. They're restricted and fixed and cannot represent living processes. Fortunately, they're also not real. Nothing in Iceland looks like this. The maps do not represent living processes. A coastline is not a clear line separating land from ocean, like on the map on the left. And the borders on the right have no resemblance to anything in the actual land. They're purely man-made artificial constructs. And that is good, because if Iceland was like this, then we would be in trouble. A coastline is what biologists call an ecotone. This is the area where one ecotype bleeds into another, like the place between a forest and a field, or the area that is constituted by the land and the ocean, both. This is such an interesting concept that other fields have all invented different words for it. Liminal spaces that are really popular in art and architecture, and interstices is another word used by Whitehead. So another example, as we see on the right here, it could be the places in Iceland where cold water from a mountain stream meets the boiling water from a geothermal spring and become one stream. And both of them contain different forms of life. What happens when they meet? I'm not a microbiologist, I don't know, but I know that something new happens. It's evolution happening in real time. As Whitehead said, life lurks in the interstices. We could also define a glacier as either a thing or as a process. We could just look at the sheet of ice, but that is already in a process with the land underneath it and the air and the temperature around it. Now, I wanted to create and take credit for the word glacial assemblage, but it turned out that that is actually already in use to describe just this, the interaction between the ice and the land, the soil underneath it. But I do want to take this concept and take it a step further, because the process of a glacier is much wider. Rivers are created by them. The coastline is defined by them. They bring sediments and cold water. There would be no lobsters near the town of Höpp if it wasn't for Vatnajökull. And the cold water affects other parts of the ocean and the life in it, which raises the question that I've been wondering for a while. How far does the effects of Vatnajökull reach? Where does it end? My guess is that it might be a small but relevant part of the global, or at least regional, climate and ocean systems. So here in a type of conclusions, the point of the lecture, the provocative and weird phrase here is that Iceland is not an Iceland. But by which I mean the same as to say that a person is not a person. If we can zoom in and see that it's clear that it is a continuous process. The landscape is always changing, and the landmass is both sinking and rising, expanding and retracting. The continental plates are pushing each other. Energy is being bursting up from beneath, creating tension and occasionally exploding. And no volcano or glacier or a mountain is an individual thing either. They're all just the visible interconnected parts of vast underground processes. So compare this to when we take a human and zoom in and see that a human is defined by many non-human elements. We can also zoom out, and then it becomes clear that we are not the independent, self-contained place that we sometimes think ourselves as. We're deeply entangled with the rest of the world. Our glaciers are part of the world ocean and climate systems, I suspect, and our society is part of the global economic system. A melting glacier in Iceland signals a problem for the rest of the world, and a drought or heat wave in Asia or Europe is a problem for Iceland. So we need to stop thinking of the impacts of climate change in Iceland from an isolated perspective and just think of melting glaciers or landslides. Everything that happens in the rest of the world can have an effect on us. So we're already interaffected, entangled, and interacting with other processes everywhere. Iceland does not exist as an individual island. Nothing does. Thank you.